Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayer TFT patch rundown video. The Dawn of Heroes mid-set patch for set 5 is finally here. Today we'll be briefly taking a look at what was added as well as the plethora of balance changes being introduced with patch 11.15. For a list of all the changes, we recommend checking out the patch notes themselves. So we've got a lot to cover, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we get into the list of balance changes, let's talk about a few of the new mechanics being added. First up is the addition of Radiant items. These are replacing the Shadow items mechanic, so say goodbye to Shadow components. Instead of being items that you can build, Radiant items will show up on round 3/6 with a list of 5 items for you to decide on. Keep in mind that you only get one Radiant item per game, so be sure of your choice before you make it. Overall, Radiant items look like a better implemented mechanic than Shadow items. We'll have to see how they play out in the meta moving forward, but so far, they seem well received. Next is another new mechanic and one we might see return in future sets. Divine Blessing is a drop that occurs once a player drops below 40 health. Think of it like a type of comeback mechanic, though every player eventually gets one in a game if they drop below the health threshold. The contents of the Divine Blessing are random, but usually high in value. The drops can be multiple things, and every player gets the same value in their drops. This means that the Divine Blessing has 2 components. Every player will get 2 components for their own drop when they get below 40 health. The exact components will change, but the value of it being 2 components does not. Divine Blessings are a neat way to introduce a new type of comeback mechanic and potentially open the door to more types of play like loose streaking on purpose. And the last new mechanic to talk about is the Tome of Traits. Basically, this is a possible drop from the PvE rounds as well as the Divine Blessing. It'll go to your bench and you sell it to choose from 4 different emblems. These emblems can be of any trait, even ones you can't make with a spatula. This will make for interesting situations when things like 6 Ranger is attainable when it normally is not. Overall, a neat mechanic, but maybe adds a bit too much variance. Next up, let's talk about system changes in patch 11.15. The first major change is to loot orbs. There's a lot of small changes they've done, but the Spark Notes version is they've upped the amount of value for smaller orbs, removed 4 gold openings, and lowered the value of the higher end orbs slightly. We recommend reading the patch notes to see the full list of what's been changed, as it's a lot of small adjustments. One major thing about the loot orbs is the number of components that you'll have after Raptors. The minimum amount was around 12 components before, but with the addition of Radiant items, the new minimum is 10 components plus the Radiant item. Effectively, this ends up being the same amount, but it's worth keeping in mind you may want to be slightly more stingy with early components since you'll be getting less dropped overall. Keep in mind there are potentially more components you can gain, including from extra armories and the Divine Blessing. This is just the minimum amount guaranteed. Next are adjustments to the Armory. We'll be quick here as well, but the 2/2 Armory is now 2 standard components. 3/2 Armory has been removed, and instead there's a Radiant Armory on 3/6. The 4/2 Armory is back to being guaranteed with either 2, 3, or 3 components with 1 special item. They've lowered the chances of the 5/2 Armory, plus it will never contain components. And lastly, the 6/2 and 7/2 Armories are unchanged. Wow, that was a lot. Without Shadow components, the armor is less impactful early on in the game, hence the removal of the 3/2 Armory and the 2/2 Armory only being 2 components. It's still important to be aware of the Armory timings, especially for the Radiant items on 3/6. The last 2 system changes are relatively small. In the Stage 5 carousel, there will sometimes be unbuildable emblems like the Ranger example we gave earlier. Stage 6 and on will sometimes be full items and sometimes contain those emblems as well. Lastly, the number of champions has been reduced to 57 from 58. This isn't too big of a deal, but worth keeping in mind. Let's move on to the trait changes for patch 11.15. We won't be covering all the new traits and champions or the removed champions and traits, so be sure to check out the patch notes for those. There's 2 traits with major reworks, the first being Abomination. They've done a lot of changes to this trait, but overall the goal was to make the monstrosity more of a tank and less of a damage dealer. This means the damage of the monstrosity has been lowered significantly. To compensate for the reduced damage, they've added scaling for the Abomination to increase per stage. It's now a 20% increase to both health and AD depending on the stage. Keep in mind there is still scaling from the champion star level, so this new scaling is in addition to that. One other important change is that allied death required is 2 instead of 3, so the monstrosity will appear much faster. The other rework trait is Forgotten. This is a major rework as the initial Forgotten mechanic was based around shadow items. Now they instead gain the bonus attack damage and ability power from winning combat rounds. The bonus is similar as it's still 10% increase but stacks up to 5 times. Besides the mechanic change, they also altered the scaling for Forgotten tiers. It's now a 2, 4, 6, 8 synergy, making it easier to splash in Forgotten champions. Overall, they likely want to keep Forgotten for the theme, but honestly, they may have been better off removing the trait entirely. It's now just a variation of Warlord from set 4 and doesn't feel interesting anymore. Now onto the adjusted traits, which there are a lot of. We'll talk about some of the more relevant changes, but the biggest adjustment for the mid-set is the addition of extra tiers for most traits. Brawlers, Mystic, Ranger, and Revenant all got additional tiers added to them. To hit those upper tiers, you do need to find the emblem as they're not buildable with any components. But the actual balance changes, Assassins are being buffed to 20, 40, 75% critical chance and having the damage adjusted to 30, 50, 70%. Basically, Assassins took a big hit by losing Katarina and LeBlanc. Since Nocturne is really the only carry now, they've buffed the overall damage of the trait. This does mean Assassins are stronger, but keep in mind you may have a harder time hitting 4 Assassin early as you do need Diana, and having 6 Assassin is less likely since you need the emblem. Everyone knows Dawnbringer ended up being one of the best traits at the end of set 5, so naturally they're nerfing it in 11-15. The max health heal, healing ticks, and damage amp per proc of healing are all being lowered. This is definitely just straight up nerfs to Dawnbringer, so be aware of that before committing to them. Draconic got a big boost in power for the mid-set as Galio makes hitting 5 Draconic much easier. To balance how quickly you can play 5 Draconic, they've lowered the value of the eggs. For 3 Draconic, the value is now 3.14 gold from 3.25, and 5 Draconic eggs are down to 7 gold from 9.25. Still, even with lower value per egg, the fact that you can hit 5 Draconic a lot easier is a huge buff to the trait. Like Forgotten, Hellion are now a 2, 4, 6, 8 trait, and oh man, does that make playing them feel a lot better. Being able to splash in 2 Hellion instead of committing to 3 is actually quite an impactful change. This is definitely an all-around solid change to an existing trait. Ironclad was nerfed a fair amount, as was Mystic. Both of these splash traits became commonplace at the end of set 5, so lowering their value is all around a good decision. They're still playable and a necessity depending on the lobby, so don't ignore these 2 traits. Nightbringer is losing some shield scaling at tier 6, but gaining a lot for 8 as it's going from 140 to a whopping 250. The bonus damage is being adjusted at 8 to now be 80% up from 50%. While the rest of Nightbringer is effectively unchanged, they made chasing 8 of the trait quite appealing. Will it come into play often? Unlikely, but at least the option is there. The last relevant balance change is to Skirmishers. The scaling for the shield is going to 20, 40, 100% from 25, 45, 75%. In addition to that, the attack damage per second is going to 3, 5, 15 from 3, 6, 12. Basically, they've made early Skirmishers a bit worse and 9 Skirmishers significantly better. Again, the likelihood of hitting the upper tier of any trait is unlikely, but if you do, 9 Skirmishers will certainly be powerful. With that, let's switch over to the relevant champion changes for patch 11.15. As it turns out, Leona was a bit too good for a 1-cost tank. Naturally, this means they're nerfing her with the damage reduction of her ability going to 30, 50, 200 from 30, 60, 250. And her mana pool is going to 80 from 60. Necessary nerfs considering the value Leona would bring as a frontliner, especially for redeemed boards. Hecarim is getting several adjustments, most notably to having his mana pool increased to 75, 125 from 40, 90. This makes him feel far less likely to spam cast during fights. They're also nerfing his healing to be 350 at every tier, meaning 3-star Hecarim isn't all that scary anymore. And lastly, his damage is going up slightly to 200, 400, 600 from 250, 350, 500. Overall, this does make Hecarim a lot weaker and maybe a bit too harsh a nerf. Real quick for Sejuani, she's now a Brawler. With the potential for increased health, they've rightfully lowered her ability's bonus defensive stats to 80, 125, 250 from 100, 150, 300. Syndra gets a health boost of 50, and most importantly, the units she throws are not untargetable. Hooray! This means no more chasing after units, at least that's the hope. Ashe gets a boost of damage, her mana nerfed, and loses Verdant. Considering Rangers and Draconic are overall better, Ashe should be in a healthy spot for the meta. Considering how well Zyra has been doing with the Abomination, it's no surprise to see her nerfed. Expect your Zyras now to do less damage, along with the stun duration being nerfed. A major change was to Aphelios, who now has 150 mana instead of 90. This change is because they increased the attack damage scaling, base damage, and number of targets for his ability by a lot. Now Aphelios, when he casts his ability, will hit hard. That said, his consistent damage has been lowered, so plan around boosting the damage of his ability more so than his auto attacks. Diana lost Dragonslayer, so they buffed her accordingly. This means 100 more health, attack damage going up to 75, and her mana down to 140 from 160. In addition to that, they have buffed her ability's damage to 300-450 from 250-350. It may not be enough to compensate for losing Dragonslayer, but she's certainly stronger than before without traits. A major 5-cost change is to Garen. First off, goodbye God King, which is the useless trait to begin with. Instead, Garen is now victorious. Basically, he gains a big boost of damage with his auto attack when he kills a unit. Alongside that change, his mana is going from 100 all the way up to 180. The damage of his ability is going up slightly, as is the shield he gains. Plus, the duration of the shield is going up to 5 seconds from 4. Overall, Garen is less tanky with the mana change, but now packs a lot more damage. The last champion change worth noting is to Teemo, as they finally fixed it so his Hellion clone gains the Cruel passive. This is honestly pretty big for late game Hellions, considering Cruel is a guaranteed win for the round if Teemo's the last one alive. There's 3 major item changes to talk about, so let's cover those. Oh, and Trap Claw is now Banshee's Claw, which had the same effect as Banshee's Claw did as a shadow item. For the major item changes, the first rework is to Dragon's Claw. It grants 200 magic resistance, but the biggest change is it now hurts whichever champion does magic or true damage to it. The damage is equal to 30% of the caster's max health with a 1-second cooldown. How strong this item is depends a lot on the meta, but at least it's a far more interesting item than it used to be. Hand of Justice has been changed to now provide 10 AD and 10 AP plus healing for 10% of the damage dealt. One of those buffs is increased to 40 at the beginning of each planning phase. Basically, Hand of Justice is more consistent. Instead of relying on hitting one buff or the other, you gain a diminished version of both, with one being buffed each round. All around, great changes to this item. And lastly, they've reworked Titan's Resolve to grant stacks on attack rather than on crit. This makes it much easier to use on multiple champions, so they did lower the amount per stack to 2 from 3. This is still another great item change. And that's going to be it for today's video, folks. As with any mid-set patch, there's tons of changes, so make sure you have the patch notes on hand before diving into Ranked. Let us know in the comment section below what changes you're the most excited for. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future GiantSlayerTV videos.